Welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us online and here at the ASU California Center at the historic Herald-Examiner building. With great respect, Zócalo Public Square acknowledges the Xiuhtezcatl, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Yangna that we now know as downtown Los Angeles. We honor their elders, past and present, and the Xiuhtezcatl descendants who are part of the Gabrielino Tongva and the Fernandeño Tataviam nations. We recognize that the Tongva are still here, and we are committed to uplifting their stories, culture, and community. As Kuyam, we recognize our responsibility and obligation to care for their land. I'm Bianca Collins. I'm Director of Public Programs at Zócalo Public Square, an Arizona State University media enterprise. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to each other. Everything we do is free and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and present conversations like this one. You can find us at zocalopublicsquare.org on podcast platforms and YouTube, so please subscribe for our latest programs. We were founded in 2003, and we are now celebrating our 20th birthday year. Tonight, we present the final program of our 2-year event and editorial series, How Should Societies Remember Their Sins?, supported by the Mellon Foundation. We've convened a series of public conversations that took us to Jackson, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee, and an array of original work published on our website to address this question, exploring how societies around the world collectively remember their transgressions and make attempts at repair, and how we might imagine new paths forward. We continue this series this evening by asking, how does confronting our history build a better future? I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, William Sturkey. William is a historian at the University of Pennsylvania who specializes in the history of race in the American South. He's the author of Hattiesburg, an American city in black and white, which won Zócalo's Book Prize in 2020. His next book, The Ballad of Roy Benavidez, The Life and Times of America's Most Famous Hispanic War Hero, will be published in 2024. Over to you, William.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Wonderful, terrific. So, I'm William Sturkey. I'm a historian at the University of Pennsylvania, and it is an honor to be here tonight hosting the 4th and final installment in the series, How Should Societies Remember Their Sins? We have an incredible panel of folks here tonight. People who are not just public servants, I would say, but who are also innovators and creators and builders. And I'm very excited to introduce them to all of you. I'm going to ask that we hold our applause till I finish all 3 introductions so that we can actually get into the conversation, because I've got a mouthful to say just to introduce their accomplishments and their background, so get ready. To my immediate left, Xiuhtezcatl Martinez is an advocate, activist, and hip-hop artist. Recently named to Time's Next 100, Xiuhtezcatl has felt called to change the narrative on what it means to be an activist from the age of 6, and has spoken multiple times at the UN, addressing the General Assembly. Xiuhtezcatl has also been a guest on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah and Real Time with Bill Maher. Has been featured on PBS, National Geographic, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, Vogue, Nickelodeon, CNN, HBO, Netflix, and Vice, and has been photographed by Annie Leibovitz. To his left is Phillip Picardi, an award-winning journalist and editor best known for revolutionizing Teen Vogue, leading a social justice-based strategy that caused the publication to become the fastest-growing women's magazine in the United States. Once dubbed the Prince of Condé Nast by New York Times, Picardi went on to found Them, Condé Nast's first LGBTQ plus publication, before becoming the youngest editor-in-chief of Out magazine. He then decamped for a master's at Harvard Divinity School. Inspired by his studies, he left the media world to pursue direct service and advocacy for the LGBTQ community, and he is currently the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at the Los Angeles LGBT Center, the world's largest LGBT nonprofit. Last but not least is Krista Tippett, journalist and National Humanities Medalist. There's a wonderful picture of her with Barack Obama receiving the National Humanities Medal. She hosts the Peabody Award-winning podcast On Being, which has been played or downloaded over 450 million times. She founded and leads the On Being Project, a media and social healing organization pursuing deep thinking and moral imagination, social courage, and joy towards the renewal of inner life, outer life, and life together. Her latest book is Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living. Please join me in welcoming our incredible panel here tonight. So, as the moderator, I will begin with some questions for our esteemed panelists. Part of the wonderful thing about having such an esteemed group is I can ask them very hard questions that I don't have any idea about the answer to. And then we'll dive into questions from the audience. So if you're thinking of a question throughout the start of our session here, please be ready to stand over to our left here, where there will be a microphone for audience questions. And for those of us that are watching online, you can submit questions in the live chat on YouTube. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm actually going to start at the far end with Krista. Okay, Krista, I was listening to an episode of your podcast recently, and you were talking to Isabel Wilkerson about her new book. And there were 4 metaphors that you all were using to describe the past in our society, and the 2 that really appealed to me were the body, but then an old home was one of the ones. And you know, American history is old and complicated, and there are parts that are maybe perhaps rotten or that need to be fixed or maintained or restored. And I just wonder, you know, if in this country, confronting our history isn't just fixing the obvious things that were wrong, but it also means to confront certain people and even confront people's ideals about what America is and even confront their ideals about social hierarchy and their own values. And so I just wonder, as we start this conversation about confronting our history, what does it mean when you're also confronting other people in this society and then challenging them to take that journey with you?
That's a complicated question. So I guess all I can say is that I feel like there is confrontation to happen, and I also think that it's really a way our brains work, that we see what is most distressing and frightening, and we see who is most distressing and frightening to us, and we start to generalize about lots and lots of people on the basis of those most extreme voices. And I think that's really a dynamic that's very alive in our culture, and it shuts down our imaginations about how much actual space there is to step into, and people there are to walk alongside, even if there is disagreement. I think there are more people who have questions alongside their answers and curiosity alongside their convictions. And so I would say I feel like my calling that I feel is to kind of soften that space and kind of shine a light on that space where confrontation isn't actually the necessary key. And again, that's not like, I think there are these different levels of work that we have to be doing at the same time, and some of us are called to different aspects of that work. So I guess that's how I look at that.
Yeah, fair. Let's move toward me. Phillip, generally speaking, what does it mean to confront our history?
So when I was first the editorial director of Teen Vogue, before Teen Vogue had really gone viral, so I was like 23 at the time, and Nancy Reagan had just passed away. And our sister publications at Glamour and Vogue and other women's outlets were publishing slideshows of her gowns, like gowns, beautiful gowns, to quote Aretha Franklin. And it was like this glowing kind of tribute that to me was reading like this hagiography of Nancy Reagan. And at Teen Vogue, we were a newsroom that was majority folks who were under the age of 30, and many of us were queer. And we were kind of taking an issue with the general media coverage. And so we actually published a piece called "Nancy Reagan Did Nothing as Thousands of LGBTQ People Died of HIV/AIDS." And the story that we were unearthing was for our audience, which is young Americans, young American women predominantly, who may not have been familiar with the Reagan administration. So this may have been their first time actually ever hearing about Nancy Reagan. Mm-hmm. We wanted to make sure that we were bringing that actual historical context to the conversation, because Hillary Clinton had been on television actually thanking Nancy Reagan for her contributions to the community during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so the story that we told was about how Rock Hudson, the American actor, had basically been in Paris as he was living out the end of his life. And he needed presidential intervention to get access to medical treatment for his end-of-life care. And he called the White House because the Reagans were his friends. And Nancy Reagan famously answered the phone and hung up on him without offering him help. And we were roundly critiqued for this coverage by people who were watching Fox News and who were insisting that their daughters would never read our publication again. And I was nervous because I thought that my job was in jeopardy. I was called into my boss's office the next day, and I was pretty sure I was going to get fired. And so I was really nervous. It was I'd only been on the job for 6 months. And by the time somehow that I was, walking in for my final show at Condé Nast, Elton John's AIDS Foundation had emailed Anna Wintour and said, "Thank you so much to Teen Vogue for telling the truth about what happened to our community, because it's so easy for people to forget." And I understand, right, that the critique was that it may have felt disrespectful of the recent passing of this woman. And I do hold space and compassion for that, while also holding a deep-seated rage for the people who died in shame, who were people who I could have built connections with and who could have been proud forebearers of queer tradition that never got to live out the full potential of their lives or see the full potential of our movement in their lifetimes, despite that being something that they deserved. Yeah. And I was really proud of us for saying what no one else was willing to say in that moment, because the collective consciousness of America can be very short. And if we're not going to carry on the tradition and be honest with each other about the history and really actually trust each other, and in our case, trust young people to have the complexity to hold these truths all at once, which I believe young people can, I always have, then I think that we're just doomed to repeat the sins of our past.
Yeah. I can already see the layers building between your two answers. And I want to add another one. Xiuhtezcatl, so often when we think about confronting our history, it's about confronting people who have been, oppressors or systems that have resulted in some sort of disadvantage for people. But what if we look at that through the lens of the environmental movement? What does confronting our history look like through the lens of some of the movements that you've been involved with?
I don't think it changes a whole lot. I would say, I think the evolving analysis that I see really strongly held by a lot of people in the environmental justice and the climate justice space recognize and understand that the systems of power that have created the climate crisis, for instance, are intrinsically connected to many of the systems of injustice in this country that have perpetuated colonial violence against indigenous peoples and the stealing of their lands and the enslavement of African peoples. That many of these systems of injustice are so deeply intertwined. I think a thirst for profit, for land, for the exploitation and kind of sacrificing of communities, of Black and brown and poor communities, historically has always been at the root of the destruction of the environment. And so I think we find ourselves at a really interesting moment within the climate and environmental justice space where it's hard to talk about any of it without understanding how deeply interconnected all of it is. You see imagery of polar bears and kind of, we talk about the carbon emissions and climate in context of the climate crisis, but fundamentally it is these larger systems of power that have kept money and politics from these fossil fuel corporations that continuously put our communities within the sacrifice zone of the construction of pipelines, of the building of power plants, of the transportation and production of fossil fuels, and least able to adapt to a world that is rapidly changing and that is experiencing more and more disastrous effects from the climate crisis. And I think a lot of the same misinformation and narratives that have existed have been seeded by these very wealthy, very powerful corporations that are invested in us being separated and confused and not critically tying and seeing the interconnectedness between these various issues. You can see millions and millions of dollars poured into PR campaigns by fossil fuel companies to make it unclear as far as how this is really political and this is really tied to social justice and human rights and racial justice. And I think indigenous liberation movements over the last decade have reminded us that the voices of the people that need to be at the forefront of these conversations are people who have been experiencing some of the most horrendous and atrocious exploitation from the United States, from the government, from the relationship between the private sector and our government for 500 years since the arrival of colonialism on this continent. And the fossil fuel industry is an extension of the way that indigenous people have been colonized, an extension of the violation of treaties that have been signed, of rights that have been promised. And so we see it as a modern manifestation, as a challenge, not just to the environment, but to our survival as indigenous people. And that message is really important because it applies to all of us. The climate crisis threatens all of our cultural survival, regardless of our ancestry or the color of our skin or where we come from. Indigenous people, for us, it's oftentimes just easier to see because there's a very unbroken line that has been maintained of our relationship to the land, to our water, through our culture, through our history, through our stories. So I think that it's much more intertwined than we would think. And in environmental movements, I'm very happy to see more and more dialogue that is surfacing within that context of us recognizing and understanding that racial justice, that labor, that women's rights, that kind of the intersection of all these different spaces is really important when we look at something as broad and as much of a hyper object as the climate crisis is.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask the same question of all three of you, but I want to cue it up by offering an example from Zócalo this week. So Zócalo on Wednesday published an article by the law professor and historian Margaret Burnham. She teaches at Northeastern. And she talked about, in this great article, I would encourage everybody to go to Zócalo's website and check it out. She talked about a lynching case from Virginia near the turn of the last century. And so she also talked about different rape cases that resulted in executions. We used to execute people in the United States South for being convicted of rape. And of course, she made the point that a lot of these people were African American men who were convicted by these juries that were all white, and there's all sorts of problems with race there. But she was saying that if we confront that history, if we go through and look at all the cases individually and then exonerate those people or more fully look into the evidence and the process by which they were convicted, then that will help us better understand the criminal justice system today. And that will then lead to new policies that can help people who are fallen victim to that system today. And so just with that example to prompt you, my question to you is, what does confronting our history do in your view? So Margaret Burnham was saying that can help us build new policies for mass incarceration. For you, what are the most important potential results for confronting our history in terms of how they might affect our society in the future?
I think Canada gave us a really good example when there was an immense amount of dialogue and research and the foundation of something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was founded to basically do extensive studies into the massive graves that were discovered at many of the residential schools that stole Indigenous children from their families and from their communities in Canada. And this was a very, arduous process, and a lot of research and data was collected, and a lot of crocodile's tears shed by different, prime ministers and elected officials in Canada. And at the end of everything, what we see is Canada that has a bit of a reputation of being, perhaps a little bit more progressive or socially aware, as a lot of policy that is implemented here in the United States. The continuation of violation of the rights of Indigenous people and the failure to adequately create repair, even in the name of creating this entire commission that had a national context and implication in the ways that it reckoned with its history. It had a reconciliation to a degree with the information and the stories that it collected. And at the end of the day, Indigenous people were not left much better as a result of it. And in 2020, before the pandemic hit, there were raids that happened in the Wet'suwet'en camps and different Indigenous communities in Canada, fossil fuel corporations going in and raiding these communities, of disrupting their ceremonial grounds, of challenging their treaty rights. And many of the young women in particular that were organizing and that were leading these protests, they declared that reconciliation is dead. And it was a very powerful statement that took place kind of at various events that were spurred into action across Canada of despite a settler colony and the remnants of a settler colony, as Canada is, having the intentions of creating this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it doesn't go far enough to actually create the repair that we need. So I think thinking about that critically, within the context of how we exist, is even a land acknowledgement is a nice formality. But at the end of the day, when we look at power and how power is distributed and how land is tied to power, we have a long ways to go to do the deep work to not just reconcile or unearth injustices and bring them to the table and kneel in Congress or whatever it may be that is symbolically gesturing towards some kind of social progress. But fundamentally, the people who hold power that have resulted in the oppression of many of our communities are not interested in dividing that power, in returning land, in doing the deep work that is much more complicated than a lot of the stuff that exists on the surface or that is virtue signaled by our politicians and our elected officials. So it's a complicated thing, but I think I also, to this day too, continue to always follow Indigenous leadership and how the conversation around land return and land back is spurring a very different kind of dialogue that does center the return of power and resources to Indigenous peoples.
Yeah. Phillip and Krista, whoever wants to take it, what promise does confronting our histories hold for the future?
I think, so right in California, for the past 10 or so years, we have had progressive policy that has allowed for LGBTQ curriculum to be taught in schools. And LGBTQ history is largely not taught to LGBTQ people. And so similar to other marginalized folks, right, or folks who live at the intersections of these identities, we spend our lives looking for breadcrumbs to find where our past might be and where our spiritual past might be and how we belong. And the thing about the history not being taught is that it allows for a misunderstanding to take root, and it allows for erasure, obviously, to happen too. So in California, in Los Angeles especially, we have 61 upcoming school board elections, and white nationalists are running for many of these school board seats right here in Los Angeles County and the surrounding areas. In Glendale over the summer, we had Proud Boys, Moms for Liberty, and other far-right extremist groups showing up to a school board meeting where the Glendale School Board was being asked to recognize June as Pride Month. And the school board meeting that our employees attended to show up to support LGBTQ parents or students was locked down by the police because the protest outside had turned so violent that they needed to shelter in place for 3 hours until the police could get the protesters under control. And this is happening right here in our backyards, not too many miles from here. And there's a growing movement in schools like in Chino Valley, Glendora, Orange County, et cetera, that if a student starts using different pronouns at school or dressing a different way at school, the teacher is legally required to call the parents and tell the parents about the student's gender identity, which is called a forced outing, which is a gross violation of a child's privacy and consent, and could very much endanger those children. When we're not honest about history, when we're not teaching the full story, it allows people to fill in the blanks about us. And they only try to police the history that's taught because they know that it is so powerful, and they know that it challenges the people who hold the power, right? And so as we're fighting in this upcoming election right here in California, even with all of the atrocities happening in the world and across the nation, what we're really worried about is like, how does the erasure of history and of these curriculums contribute to the erasure of our students and allow potentially a whole new generation of people to fall back into a misinformation campaign that once again is painting us as enemies of the American people or enemies of the American family. And that's why it's so important for us to be able to to have a well-rounded and intersectional approach to what we are learning and what we are absorbing and reading. We can't build empathy unless we are honest about these histories.
Yeah. Krista, what do we stand to gain from confronting our histories?
You know, the example that you started with of lynching, I recently interviewed Clint Smith, who wrote that wonderful book, How the Word Is Passed. I think that show may air next Thursday, I'm not sure, in the next week or two. And he and I both actually right now have an interest in Germany, where I spent, this is really going to date me, but my 20s in divided Cold War Berlin in the 1980s, and have become really fascinated now at, having watched this place where an incredible concentration of atrocity and brutality, right? Unimaginable atrocity happened. And having been there kind of 40 years after the end of the Holocaust and the war, and now 40 years on from that, and seeing this 75, 80-year arc of a place, the thing about Germany is that the whole world was, they lost that war, the whole world was watching to see the reckoning, and it's not perfect, because what human beings do is not perfect, but I have recently been back to Germany thinking about how when I was there in the 1980s, they understood and I understood, or we all believed, that I was from the country of innocence, right? Like, they had the terrible history, and we didn't have a perfect history, but it's this American way of believing that we're always getting better, right? And in fact, something that I've been thinking about a lot, and that Clint and I talked about, is, the Holocaust was this handful of years and millions of people, and, the Allies walked, German citizens, average German citizens, walked themselves through the concentration camps. In this country, we have these centuries actually of atrocity, right? But there aren't, lynchings, for example, happen kind of town by town and tree by tree. And what if, what would it mean for Americans to walk through, right? What would our equivalent be? And we can talk about the longer history.
Yeah.
At a human condition level, which is how I come at things, it always amazes me how we don't look for and internalize truths in our life together at the communal level, things we know to be true individually and in our families. For example, in a family, the stories that are not being told, the things that cannot be spoken, are absolutely haunting and warping everything else. Growth is not possible. The question you asked, I think, is what does it affect? What does it affect if we confront our history? And I want us also to be aspirational about, I think what we can walk towards is wholeness, right? And actual growth. And just remembering that these things that we're struggling to do well, right? Even to get diversity right, or equity, or these words we use that are all too small for what we're trying to do, and yet we're working with them because this is the language and the tools we have. But these are not themselves the goal, right? The goal is to be whole human beings in a whole society. In that sense, this notion of diversity is, we are diverse, right? It's we just have to live into the fullness of that reality in a way that is healthy and whole and redemptive for everyone, for that whole spectrum of humanity that already exists, but we don't know how to honor that.
Yeah.
So I think of it in those terms. this is a good, right? This is something we should all long for. As I think as we get healthy, if we get healthy in our families, we long to have the whole story of ourselves to work with.
Krista, I want to ask you a direct follow-up. This is our 4th session, and I think a lot of what I've been thinking about has been leading to this. And I think you do a wonderful job on your podcast of bringing people together, and I think that we're in a communal space, and a lot of people agree that we should teach our histories. But very directly, what would you say, or what do you say, to people who don't think that we should be teaching our histories? There are people that think that a book about children growing up in Jim Crow, Mississippi should not be taught only to their kid, but to any other kid in the school. And so what would you say to that sort of a person to sort of bring them to, bring them along, or sort of, confront whatever they're worried about?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's kind of not the angle in that I take. And I can also say that I do that because I know other people are working in schools, right?
Yeah.
I also just want to say, confrontation is a necessary word and it's a necessary act, but it's not necessarily very pragmatic, right? So in different situations and with different human beings, sometimes if what you want to do is create new possibility, confrontation may not be the best opening, right? So I guess what I'm always thinking about is also this matter of how to open hearts and minds and imaginations. And so sometimes what that is about is the creation of a hospitable space. Now, I want to be really clear that, there are boundaries around that, right? So if there is danger, right? That's creating a hospitable space is not about being stupid, right? But again, I do believe, I guess what I'm trying to engage in is the creation of quiet encounters and relationships away from the glare of the hyper-reactive societal kind of so-called discourse that we have, where people can get outside of these boxes that they find themselves in. But I find, this whole matter of schools and education is so fraught, right? Mm-hmm. So highly charged, that this thing I'm talking about is probably not going to happen in that context. Mm-hmm. We're doing at On Being, we're doing, I used to be on the radio 52 weeks a year for 20 years, and that was enough. And now we're doing a couple of seasons a year of the podcast, but what we're doing the rest of the time are what we're calling quiet conversations. So actually bringing people together without publicity and no social media, and with a commitment of relationship over a number of years. I actually think that, in the conditions of our life together as they are now, as we are in our infancy with these technologies and with social media, and it's just a hard time in the life of the world, and I believe we're all living out of our fear place, and we know what that does in a body and what it does in a collective body. So that also, that is kind of a way that I come at it. What can we do kind of below that radar to kind of create seeds for healing? Mm-hmm. And also knowing that what we're talking about here, what we're longing for, is not social change, it's transformation, it's social evolution that we need, right? And that is what can only become possible when we're telling and living with the fullness, the true reality of our story, mm-hmm. of who we've been, as well as who we want to be. And that needs a lot of different muscles being flexed.
Would either of you like to respond also?
I think one of the things that's always hard to digest in these settings is, when you come to the table with your whole self, right? And we deal with this all the time with our folks, right? Especially the clients who are coming to us for help and for community. One of the things that's really hard is that sometimes to get to the point of change, we're often asking folks who bear the brunt of society's ills to hold the grace. And that, I don't have the solution for that, but I just want to name that it really sucks, you know? And that there is so much work and labor being done to what to me feels like teach people to treat people with dignity and decency. And that is, and I understand that it's hard work. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying I don't value the work, but I think for us, what we often find is like to create that space. And I dealt with this when I was at divinity school too. It's like to create that space for this difficult dialogue. What was happening is that people were getting harmed throughout the process.
And that's not right, right? So that you, more of us need to step in who are not most in the front lines of, like, most vulnerable to be wounded, right? So I'm saying we need to create circles and webs of relationship and of accompaniment around that.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, and I think it's noble and important work. And I think at the same time, if we are doing that work, what also does the work look like for those circles to just exist within the community so that folks within community can find support from each other and find their soft like landing ground, you know, and make sure that our folks, you know, those folks who may be impacted by those conversations really do have their roots somewhere and know that they're supported. Because that is, I think that's what is, I think people are fed up with having to be graceful right now. And I just wanted to say that I really feel and hear that, and I hold space for that, yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder about the role of religion. And there's so there are two Masters of Divinity School graduates on our panel here today. And so I need to ask about this, but then also, you know, the church has often been a space for healing, for productive conversations in the past. And we all hear about declining church membership. But I mean, at the end of the day also, you know, Christianity, I mean, the Old Testament it's a usable past, is what it's meant to be in some ways. And so I wonder about, what do you think about the role of religion in terms of these conversations about historical confrontations? You first.
It's really complicated right now. I don't know. Again, I'm going to say, you know, one thing I'm going to say is that if I'm looking for the healing, transformative role of the best of what our religious and spiritual traditions, the best of what they represent in the human enterprise, I'm not necessarily looking at the institutions. And I'm certainly not looking at the loud voices who stand up to represent everyone else and who actually, you know, and there's a collusion of the way journalism works, and people who are very willing to speak on behalf of God and all, right, and all people of faith. And having said that, I care about, I do care about these traditions as the place in the human enterprise across time and space where we have language and practices and rituals like confession and repentance and lamentation and redemption. We don't have that. This is where this vocabulary lies in our midst. That is not necessarily being best represented by, when I say that, I'm just also thinking about, again, the loudest representatives of because there's the thing about religious people and communities who are, I believe, being most faithful to the core of these traditions are not throwing themselves in front of cameras and microphones. They are getting on with care. So that is kind of invisible, but I do believe that in our midst is essential to walking into this future where all of our children, can live into their deepest humanity, and where we have human flourishing and not just survival.
Xiuhtezcatl, Phillip?
You want to go first? Cool. Admittedly, I think I have a lot to learn about religion and religious institutions and the complexity that has been behind the relationship that I have to it, which I would say explicitly like with Catholicism, right? My upbringing, my understanding of Catholicism is the primary tool that was used to dehumanize and justify the genocide of my ancestors, and the stealing of our lands, the erasure of our language. My great-grandmother, her indoctrination into the Catholic Church is the reason that my grandfather never learned our language, and subsequently my father. I mean, so as generations went on and things changed, and a lot of people began to kind of resist a lot of the dogma and a lot of the violence that was perpetuated from kind of these institutions that were weaponized to harm our people and to erase us. There's been a lot of work to repair and to undo and to resist, and I think that I grew up with that being a pretty strong truth in how I personally relate to and understand it as an institution that has been weaponized as a tool to end an immense amount of life in this world, and that resulted in the colonization of this continent, and the millions and millions and millions of lives that were lost, the populations that were decimated in the name of God, in the name of the church. And again, my great-grandmother, to her dying breath, was a very devout Catholic woman, and the amount of love and care we had for her as a matriarch of our family, it was also a really important teaching to understand compassion and the humanity beyond, these institutions that does exist. And I think the hope that I've seen with different religious leaders and folks entering conversations, whether it's, humanitarian work or environmental spaces of, these lenses that we can see the world through being things that further humanize us. And I think that I don't know what the reckoning within the Catholic Church looks like, or, the ways in which that history is so real, and I think also very not communicated or not. The Catholic Church it remains, one of the largest landowners in the United States too. So thinking about those different relationships that we have to the Catholic-run, boarding schools that Indigenous children were shipped off to and taken to here in North America, that's a lot of my relationship to it, my context to it, and so I aspire to learn and understand too how we can reach beyond the violence of that history to create, reparative conversations and constructively understand how the church has been a tool to organize marginalized peoples, whether it's through, different histories of Black liberation movements and ways in which it has been a tool to create safe spaces for people that have been also experiencing an immense amount of violence and subjugation by various systems of oppression. So I see it very intertwined with a lot of these other power structures. I think my hope is that the humanity that is, within the people that practice whatever religion it is, or no religion at all, can surface and kind of shine through and be at the heart of the way we interact with each other of various different beliefs. And it's not necessarily a dismantling of any religion that is needed in my eyes, but I think more so a reckoning of of the impact and of the responsibility held by these different institutions to create the repair that is needed, and from there too, how can the future reflect, many of the ideals that I believe are at the heart of many of the people that do deeply believe in these spaces or in these spiritual beliefs. So I have a lot to learn, for sure.
Yeah. Phillip?
Yeah, I am an ex-Catholic. I came out of the closet when I was 14, left my confirmation classes. Much to my dad's chagrin, he named me after his favorite saint. And I found myself at odds, obviously, with the Catholic Church for a variety of reasons throughout my life. And actually, most recently at the center, we were dealing with these Catholic groups who didn't want these drag queens called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence showing up to a Dodgers game. And so they were sending bomb threats to the Dodger Stadium. I mean, it was nuts. And the Archdiocese of California released a statement that was like, if that community wants a culture war, then that's what they'll get. And it's like, oh yeah, we're really worried about the culture war with the Catholics. You know what I mean? Like, we have Cher. Like, who do you have? You know what I'm saying? So I have a really strong revulsion, towards the Catholic Church that has been lifelong and embedded in me because I was raised in Catholic school, raised by a deeply Catholic father. He used to go on these silent retreats with these Order of Franciscan monks to holy Marian apparition sites where people, believed they were seeing the Virgin Mary. And so he's a very devout man. He wanted me to be a priest because it was, if you couldn't tell, very clear from a young age that I was gay. And so he was trying to save me, And I think when I decided to leave the media because I was editing Out magazine, the nation's largest LGBTQ magazine, and it was owned by a Republican man who was donating to anti-gay politicians and stopped paying our freelancers. And so when I decided to leave Out, I had this kind of crisis about where I would go next. And the only thing that I kept hearing as a call was to go towards God. And it was so weird because I hadn't prayed since I came out of the closet. I got down on my knees, I did the sign of the cross, I said a Hail Mary, I said an Our Father, and then I said goodbye. And I said, in that final prayer to God that I didn't want to be living on the earth choosing between myself or my Creator. And if I was going to make a choice, I was going to choose myself, and I would deal with the consequences later. What I realized, when I was at divinity school and I was plunging myself into studying the Catholic mystic tradition, the history of Christianity, obviously how religion has shaped the history of the Western world, was that so many of us, right, are turning our backs on God in this moment. It's like a badge of honor to not believe, to not have faith, because it's looked at as arcane maybe, or old school, or conservative, or whatever it is. And I think that my reframe at divinity school as I was learning more really came to be like, they actually want me to not believe that I'm worthy of God. Like, they actually want to take God away from those of us who deserve God. And the idea that as a kid, I was letting these grown-ass, old virgin men take my divinity away from me when they can't take my divinity away because it is God-given, that I could go reclaim that and then use it to be the source of my power and the source of my faith and my direction in the world, was like the greatest gift I ever could have given myself. It was the gift that no Christian adult was willing to give me in my entire life. And I am so proud to be a believer, and I am also so grateful for the divinity school experience because it really taught me that faith is not just a spiritual practice or a relationship to a being. Faith is just like love in that it requires a deep discipline. It requires constantly showing up, and it requires showing up in the most unimaginable of ways. And when I think about how faith manifests itself in the world, I'm not interested in going back to a church. I'm not interested in sitting in a pew and listening to the loudest voice in the room. That's why I'm working at a community center. Like, if you want to see God, go see a social worker, right? Go see people who have sacrificed their lives to fighting for the people who need our help the most. And I just think that sense of like, we don't need God to get through this. We need prayer more than ever, actually, I would argue. And the only way through this is to believe that there's a way through it.
Yeah, thank you. I get one more question, and I'm going to have to ask you all, I'm going to try to make this a little bit less complicated, and I'm going to have to ask you all to give slightly shorter answers. But when I was reading much more about you all, there was a line from one of Philip's interviews, and you said this: "After working for over a decade in the media, I know how powerful storytelling can be as a cultural salve." And so one of the reasons that struck me in preparing for this panel was because, I'm an academic and I teach African American history and hard history, but I'm also somebody that's been consuming media in the last several years. And there has been an absolute revolution in Black storytelling, whether it's fiction or truth. Watchmen, Lovecraft Country, The Good Lord Bird, 12 Years a Slave. Like, we're telling Black stories and all sorts of stories in really different ways. And I'm not the academic that's buttoned up lecturing somebody. I'm the guy on the couch, like, cheering on, as they get away from the ghost or whatever. And I just wonder, can you say more about that sort of storytelling that isn't as academic, that isn't necessarily as demanding on our society, but is really generative and creative, as a cultural salve, as you say, where does that sort of storytelling, where does that sort of art fit into our conversation for whoever wants to jump in?
I think artists have such an important responsibility in our movements to be those that generate the imagination for the rest of the population to kind of begin to see the possibilities of a different world. And I, as someone who has been an activist my entire life and an artist my entire life, you see that the storytelling potential is, or the potential for us to kind of create the future that we know is possible through the stories that we tell, has been the center of a lot of my work over the last couple of years, as I've leaned further and further into my art, into my music, into composing, into that form of storytelling, and seeing kind of similarly to what you were sharing, a revolution and a renaissance of indigenous representation in popular culture, in media, in us having the autonomy to tell our own stories and represent ourselves and destroy caricatures and stereotypes and show up in all of our complexity through our art, our film, our fashion, our storytelling. So it's close to my heart, this question and this idea that, I think most of us don't have any illusions that music or art or film on its own will change the world or will bring forth liberation for our communities to the degree that we need it to. But I think it can help seed an imagination of a world that is radically different than the one that we see in front of us. And I think I draw so much inspiration from the role that art has played in social movements throughout history. And so I feel incredibly grateful to be amidst a generation of people who are continuing to use these different means that are perhaps less academic and are more popularly accessible to the masses to help all of us collectively dream of something outside of the chaos and the violence that we do see around us, and to see ourselves in these very nuanced and complex ways as we are as indigenous people or as folks from whatever kind of marginalized identity, when we oftentimes don't see ourselves in those ways. It can help us contextualize what is possible, beyond the violence of the world around us.
Well, so long as we're uplifting Black storytelling, I want to uplift the book, The Risk It Takes to Bloom by Raquel Willis. She's a Black trans activist from Georgia who did boots on the ground work in Oakland before moving to New York. I would encourage you to pre-order her book. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work and a vital one for our community. And I think, at the center, I moved from magazines to nonprofit, right? The thing, I loved that you uplifted fashion, because fashion, we were always trying to find a beautiful and joyful way to tell a story. So when we were photographing Halima Aden for our cover, Halima is a Somalian refugee who became a supermodel here in the United States. And UNICEF was working with us on the story, and there was all this desire for a photojournalistic approach, which is a wonderful and noble thing to do. But the Teen Vogue thing was she's on the cover of Teen Vogue. Let's turn out all of the looks that we can, and let's photograph her in this pastoral American dream, release it on the 4th of July, and call it I Am America. And it was a really triumphant and beautiful way to tell Halima's story and all of the complexities of her words that helped to illustrate that piece. When I get to nonprofit, a lot of the storytelling can sometimes emphasize folks' trauma. And sometimes what I worry about is that we were sacrificing our clients' dignity for dollars. And the thing about the center is if you go talk to a frontline worker about our clients, they're not talking about them oh, these poor people, right? We are finding ways to celebrate folks every day and make things happen. And so we really wanted to center joy in the storytelling, because so much of what Americans think of, and repeated surveys have shown this, when Americans are asked to think about a transgender person and they don't know a transgender person, they actually envision someone alone and depressed and having suicidal ideation, right? And that is so out of step with like every trans person I know. And I'm not saying that it's not possible, right? And of course it is, and we need to do whatever we can to address that. And believe me, you know, in our work we are. But we need to show a different side of the story. We need to show people being loved and celebrated and in family and accepted by their families to help be a possibility model for folks. And so one of our first storytelling pieces that we worked on at the center was like, how do we get a fundraising video that's not prioritizing trauma? And so we actually had Nicole Ritchie from The Simple Life come to the center. And we planned activities for her throughout our community center through the day. So she made pasta in our kitchen with our culinary arts students who are our senior and youth clients. She joined a senior line dancing class and danced to Mary J. Blige with our seniors. And then she jumped into a youth fashion show because the youth from the center are often involved in the ballroom scene here in Los Angeles. And it was this opportunity for us to showcase the people who we serve as the heroes of their own stories, and also to celebrate like joy and an uplifting sense of community as the core of our work. Rather than just fixing a problem, we were able to just position our community as the solution. And I think that that's so important because it helps further advance the mission of the center while showing a different view of LGBTQ people everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to kind of affirm what I've heard from both of you. We so underestimate the power of the human imagination in getting where we want to go, right? I've interviewed people across the years who, like John Lewis and Desmond Tutu and Wangari Maathai, who made things possible that no one believed possible, right? And they did it because their imagination stretched farther, and they threw their lives behind what they wanted to make possible in the world. And yes, and there has to be joy in it, right? I you know, thinking about our climate reality, our ecological reality. I was just having this conversation this week. If all we do is tell the dystopian story of the future, we are making that future. We are creating that future, right? And yes, joy. And like, you know, the thing about the existential, terrifying crises and reckonings of this century, also that I feel, especially young activists, just understanding in their bodies this wisdom that is rising up, is that the way to walk into that as the work of the rest of our lifetimes, whoever we are, is to know what we love, right? As much that be grounded in what we have to fight and confront, we have to know what we love, right? And we have to have joy, our human birthright of joy, as fuel, right? And love as fuel for those great reckonings, and to the extent that it's confrontation, that it's fighting. And all of that, right? And is how we make the story of who we want to be and make that real. And the arts are absolutely critical in this, and I think it's another reason that all of the battles that have to be fought in our schools and in education, they must be fought. And those movies and shows that you named are also education. They are also formation. They are also forming imaginations. They are also telling stories and histories. Watchmen, right? I grew up in Oklahoma and never learned about the Tulsa Massacre, right? It wasn't in books, in the school books. It was not. I spent my entire childhood until I was 18 in that state and did not know that story. And I really think that show was the single educational experience that helped me really inhabit that and own it. And that is not insignificant, even if it's not official education. These are all ways that that our minds and our conscious that are feeding the possibility of an expanded mind and consciousness, and therefore reality.
Thank you so much. We're going to send it over to Bianca for some questions from our audience.
Hello, yes, I'm over here. We only have time for a couple questions, so I want to encourage our in-person audience. If you have any questions, just get on up and come over here. I'll give you the mic. If I don't see anyone hopping up real quick, I'm going to start with an online question, and then we'll only have time for one from the in-person audience. So I will start with an online question. All right. Also a reminder, if you want to submit a question on your wristband, there's a number that you can text. Wow. All right, so the first question asks, are there examples from other cultures where forgiveness is actively practiced in restorative ways?
Well, there are.
Great start.
I mean, I think you mentioned Canada. I mean, there are different models, and none of them is perfect. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, truth and reconciliation, which I think something that is easy to do is in fact look at places where societies are taking that approach and say, but look, they're still so tortured, right? There's still so much that's wrong. And that's true. And it's also true that transformative change takes more than 3 to 5 years. And Americans in particular don't have a reality-based view of time. And therefore we waste so much time rushing to action that we then later on have to dismantle because we didn't do the discernment. But I remember when I spoke with Desmond Tutu, and he said that Europe gave him great hope because look, just a few hundred years ago, these people were in 30-year wars and 100-year wars. And it was very clear to him that what they had started with that process of national forgiveness, or forgiveness as part of this process of truth and reconciliation, was going to have to be generations and generations and generations reaching its fullness. And like there's an incredible organization actually in the context of this conversation called Facing History and Ourselves. I don't know, does anybody know that organization? Mm-hmm. They work with hundreds of thousands of teachers around the world. And with this idea that, that we have to change ourselves in order to change the society, I think, I've had this conversation with Isabel Wilkerson, and I think we had it in that conversation you heard in Seattle again last year, that the civil rights era changed laws, and even the civil rights elders, I mean, they had such a genius and sophistication in how they went about what they went about. But there was also this real faith in that generation that if we change the laws, we change the society. And as Isabel says, we changed the laws, but we didn't change ourselves. We didn't really, really engage in that. And so here we are a half century later, seeing that some of what we thought we were like on the way to completion in the 60s was just baby steps, right? And this Facing History and Ourselves, they take this holistic approach, and they are working in societies that are coming out of war and violence, and they are investing in precisely this thing we're talking about, in how does education become part of social evolution. And so, yeah, this is all happening all over the place, but again, it's quiet. It's quiet. quiet, and it's long-term work.
Just
Thank
to
you.
briefly
Oh, yes,
speak
go ahead.
super quick, I think when the conversation of land return and land back comes up for a lot of people who are interacting with it for the first time, particularly a lot of white people, there is an anxiety that is projected that the understanding of the atrocities that were done to indigenous peoples for the last 500 years and the remnants of those impacts instill a fear that when we talk about land back, that somehow this vision is a vengeful one, that we will enact the same violence in retribution when we are talking about a return of lands. And a lot of people are confused about that. Like, well, where will the white, like, are we going to be sent back to Europe, or like, what's the vibe? And I think that it's really important to understand that the conception of indigenous futurism that comes with this really beautiful and sprawling vision and complex vision of land return and of land back, and of indigenous people returning to leadership over the lands that we traditionally belong to. You can't contextualize it within the violence of the settler history that exists here in the United States, because that was never our conception of the world in the first place, was through that lens of violence. And so maybe not a perfect example of forgiveness, but many of the indigenous people that I have worked with in communities that are actively working to have lands returned to their traditional owners and stewards, our vision has nothing to do with revenge. It has nothing to do with enacting the same violence that we suffered. And it's quite the opposite, actually. It is land back for many of us encompasses a liberated future for all of us. And I think that's really beautiful. And it's despite the immense amounts of pain that have been experienced by our communities. The last thing that we want to do is to replicate those systems for anybody else. And I think that is a powerful example of looking into what we can build generatively into the future, and reaching for that aspirationally and seeing it trickle in as a reality bit by bit.
Thank you. All right, so this is our last question for the evening. We have an in-person question.
Hi, my name is Layla Hamidi. I'm really inspired by just the phrase moral imagination. It's really not seductive, but it carries so much promise with it and hope with it. And I want to understand in your thinking what the ingredients are for it, particularly if I think of what the counter would be, which is maybe moral apathy. Does it include grieving, absorption of kind of the truths? And just to make it more complex, can you guys share a moment of transformation that you've personally experienced or witnessed as kind of a takeaway of hope, because we need hope right now?
Would you say, so a moment of personal transformation? I was having trouble
A
here.
moment of personal transformation, or transformation that you've witnessed, a personal kind of in-person body experience of either witnessing or feeling that yourself.
Yeah, I think more and more we see hope needing to be such an active practice, not a box that you check or something that happens passively. And for many indigenous communities, we have seen the end of our worlds. We have seen and lived through apocalyptic times. And despite that, I am only here because we survived it. We survived the most heinous of atrocities. And someone asked me, I was speaking at a college recently, and they were asking me about, what does a liberated future look like to you? And I smiled in that moment, because part of me is like, in many ways, I'm living a version of that for those that came before me, for my ancestors and my elders, and those that hoped that we could live in a dignified way and speak our language and show up and be who we are, without the subjugation of the violence around us ever present, defining our reality. And so I think in many ways the hope that I carry comes from a long lineage of not having an option but to remain so strong in our belief, in our hope, in our optimism for there being something beyond the horizon of the injustices that we have lived through and that we have seen. And I think going home, going to Mexico, being with my community, seeing these agricultural systems that are 900 years old, the chinampas, that my family has worked and cared for these lands for generations, that they still exist despite every attempt to erase them, is a grounding and a reminder of that responsibility that we have to be hopeful to those that came before us and to those that will follow.
I've been thinking a lot about the moral apathy piece that you mentioned, which I think apathy is such a good word. Like, we're inundated, we are doom scrolling, as the kids say, on our phones, and I think the problems of the world can feel so big that it can feel useless to even engage anymore. And so, there was one day where the headlines were pretty bad, and work was pretty hard because of it. We had lost a colleague, and it was a really hard period of time. And I was speaking with someone who works with our seniors, so I mentioned that line dancing class. So there's a couple, they are both veterans, they are elders, and they go to this line dancing class every week without fail. And they were in it for like 3-4 months, but only one of them danced. And so finally, one of our social workers walked up to the guy who was on the sidelines, and she was like, "Hey, I think your husband wants to dance with you. I know you're shy, but get up and dance." And he was like, "Oh no, it's not that I'm shy, it's that I'm embarrassed I can't hear the music." His hearing aid had broken, and he was not really willing to ask us for help. And so she took him to his doctor's appointment, and we paid for a new hearing aid for him. And then he celebrated his first dance with his husband in 10 years the following week at the line dancing class. And I love this story so much because, there's this Saint Therese of Lisieux who talks about the little way, and just doing the little things and focusing on the little things will make the big things feel more manageable. And for me, that story really captures it, right? Everything was terrible and everything felt impossible. And I heard that story and I realized that we were going to get through it, and we could get through it and it would be fine. And that actually we could get through it and we could find love somehow on the other end of it.
Well, the question makes me reflect on the fact that, I grew up in Oklahoma, a place where my ancestors, came in covered wagons and restole land, and other people were forcibly marched. I grew up in a town called Shawnee, and next door was Tecumseh and Seminole, and it was Potawatomi County, and I had absolutely no knowledge of what those words and names, that those were people and peoples, and was not taught that, and actually was not curious about it. It's actually very strange to me how that the names had been kept when everything they represented had been forgotten or disappeared and desecrated. And I represent, as the elder up here, somebody who was born in the mid-20th century and have a completely different understanding of my country and the story, right, of who I am and who we are. It's embarrassing, and it's astonishing, right, to think how much had been actively forgotten and not transmitted. And it's astonishing, for me to think how much, just in the last couple of years, interviewing Joy Harjo, who's then the poet laureate, and she's in Tulsa, and our two stories of this place that we come from, which is just so emblematic of the story of our country. So, I do represent a fuller history being internalized, incredibly late, right? Shamefully late. And also, I just want to say, even just 10 minutes after we sat down up here tonight, I was kind of listening to the two of you, the three of you, and looking at you and thinking about what we're discussing and how we're discussing it. And in my lifetime, right, this would have been unimaginable, right? This conversation, this configuration of humanity, this subject, these questions, the things that are being given voice to and just named, which are just truths, but these truths haven't been alive in our midst. And they haven't been part of, and when I say our, right, like I mean our total self-understanding. And so like this is transformative, and I just want to, there's so much to despair about in the world right now. And we can all point to 10 things that we learned about or read about or participated in or probably read in the news that are also true, and this too is true. And I'm really grateful for this, and I think we also need to actively, when we have these moments of seeing the generative narrative unfolding and the fuller telling of truth and the fuller living into truth, let's take that in, right?
Yeah. You all have given us so much. We are way out of time. But thank you all so much. I know that you've given us so much and so much to think about. So thank all of you for being here. Let me just say just a few words of closing. So Zócalo is also going to give us more. By tomorrow, you will be able to find a summary of our conversation at zocalopublicsquare.org. You'll also see some fun interviews with our panelists, get to know them a little bit more. And then also, you can access all the conversations and essays that have been produced for this series. So I would encourage everyone who's curious to really dive in and subscribe to Zócalo's newsletter, their podcasts, and all their social media. For the in-person folks, we are going to have a party at this point in time. We've got the Pan Afrikan Peoples Arktet coming out in just a few short minutes. But before we do that, please join me once again. Well, thank you all for your audience, and please join me once again in thanking our panelists for tonight.
The Pan Afrikan Peoples Arktet was a band started by one Mr. Horace Tapscott in Leimert Park, nestled in the heart of South Central Los Angeles. And that band is over 200, 300 cats throughout 60 years. You got 5 of them here tonight. While I'm talking about him, this is Mr. Joel Ector, Mr. Joey Ector on upright bass. Next to him is Mr. Fundi Lejean on French horn. Fundi Lejean, French horn. Next to him is Randall Fisher on tenor saxophone. Randall Fisher. In the back with me, one Mr. Brian Hargrove. Brian Hargrove on keys. And my name is Michaela Session. We're just going to get to it. Thank you. That tune we just did was entitled Goat in the Ram Jam. It was by one Mr. Jesse Sharps, legendary Pan Afrikan Peoples Orchestra composer. But he is not a legend. He is very real. That's Jesse Sharps. That's a tune he wrote called Goat in the Ram Jam. Before that, we did a Horace Tapscott classic, The Dark Tree. Right now, we're going to get into our next two songs. The first is cut by my father, Mr. Michael Session, which he entitled Umatu. Umatu by Michael Session. After that, we're going to get into a Nate Morgan cut entitled Imrefu. One more time, that's Joel Ector on the upright bass. Next to him is Mr. Fundi Lejean on the French horn. Over here is Randall Fisher, tenor saxophone. That's Brian Hargrove on the keyboards. My name is Michaela Session. The Pan Afrikan Peoples Arktet, just a slice of the whole orchestra. Over here is my man Zero on the boards. Shouts to Zero. Sam on all things Sam. Thank you all very much. Peace. That might have been our last song, actually. I was told we had 5 minutes, like 5 minutes ago. So unless you guys are literally like rioting and throwing stuff, I think we're done. One more? Did I see somebody throw something? Riot? Riot? Okay, we'll do one more.
Thank you again to the Pan Afrikan Peoples Arktet. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We're so glad that you could join us to conclude our series. We're so honored to do this work. Please join us again for one of our upcoming programs. We will be at the Port of Los Angeles on November 12th for a diaspora dance party. Thank you again, and we hope to see you again soon.